Hey YouTube, I'm here to continue my 4-part series on a brief history of French polyphagia. Today's topic is going to be Charles Domery. Now, of course, if you know anything about him, you know that he was not born in France, he was not of French descent, but he was born nearby France, and he did spend a lot of his time there. You're going to find out why soon, and the story is actually quite interesting, especially with parallels to last week's case, Tarrare. So, before I go further, I did want to go ahead and give a disclaimer once again in case you didn't see the last video. It's sort of a similar warning. Some of the content that you're going to see here today is going to be disturbing. So if you're bothered by eating disorders, gross bodily functions, cannibalism, animal cruelty, or medical mysteries with a bad end, this may not be for you. To introduce again what we're talking about today, polyphagia is a term for excessive eating, from excess hunger or increased appetite, often with an underlying condition. There's a separate condition called pica, which involves eating objects that are not nutritious. Some people have this disorder alongside it, although the case that we're talking about today, I feel like based on the fact that a lot of the things he was eating did have some degree of nutritional value, and he had a lot more self-control than Tarrare did, I would say he probably didn't have pica. But before I get too ahead of myself, introducing Charles Domery. Like Tarrare, we're not sure if this was his real name. It sounds very anglicized, and he was later in his life spending some time in Britain, so we think that maybe he was given a false name by the British doctors who were studying him. What's remarkable about this case is that he lives parallel to Tarrare in a lot of ways. So he was born in 1778 in a place called Bench, Poland. It was considered Prussia at the time. So he was considered a Prussian citizen, therefore he would have been on the other side of the War of the First Coalition versus Tarrare, who was living in France. So you're going to see why he was on this list soon, because he did spend some time in France, and the story behind that is very interesting. But as for his childhood, he was one of 9 boys, and his mother claimed that they all had the same massive appetites, which that would have been an interesting household to live in, but nonetheless, he looked completely normal. He had a very kind disposition, but his curse was one of an interesting kind because of the specific time of day that it seemed to affect him. So when he went to bed, he would go to bed around 8 p.m., There would be a lot of sweating and such as he tried to fall asleep, and then no matter what he ate at 8 p.m. before he went to bed, he would wake up every single night at 1 a.m. and be voraciously hungry and sweating even more. So he would just eat and eat and eat if there was any food available, or, find something else other than traditional food to eat, or he would chain smoke to reduce his appetite, and then he would go back to bed. So I have a thought about this specific condition, and it's a little bit of a tangent, but bear with me. If you've ever heard of the solar kids, they had this problem where they would become paralyzed at nightfall every single day. And it was found that it was due to a neurotransmitter deficiency, and it was actually treatable. So these kids who seem to have this specific bizarre condition at a specific time of day made me think that maybe, while it would have been a different deficiency, Charles Domery may have had something similar because of the specific time of day that he always developed this extreme hunger. Anyway, he joined the military at 13, fighting on the Prussian side of the same war, the War of the First Coalition. Of course, they had to double his rations, much like Tarrare, who got 4 times the rations. They tried doubling his rations, and it was not enough for him at all. There's not much known about his time in the Prussian side of this war, but he was captured by French soldiers at some point, and he actually wound up switching sides. He joined them, and the reason is because they had better food. So when he was introduced to his new battalion, he was given a melon as a gift, and he ate the whole melon, rind and all, in front of the whole crew. So I can't imagine how they must have thought of this guy when they first met him. Like, who is this guy? What is he doing? Because these were not the same people who knew Tarrare for years and years. It was I guess it was just a different part of France. I can't imagine how interesting things would have been if they had actually lived in the same exact place and met each other. But that's all speculation. I've actually thought about doing a sort of screenplay for that. If I do, you will be the first to hear about it, trust me. So anyway, he became very well known for his voracious appetite. He could do it all the time, even though that 1 in the morning situation seems to be when his cravings were the strongest. He would definitely eat a ridiculous amount anytime he had access to food. He strongly preferred meat. If he had the choice, he would have never eaten a vegetable in his life. But if there was no food available in the middle of the night when he had those cravings, he would eat up to 5 pounds of grass every single day. It was also reported that he had a taste for cats as well. He ate 174 cats in a year one time. It was also recorded that he did have some degree of regret about doing this, and he tried to kill them before he ate them as a humane offer, but sometimes his impulses were too strong and he would just eat these things. So, these things happen, I suppose, with this level of polyphagia. Now, it's odd to me because obviously in modern day, there are polyphages as well, but none of them seem to have a tendency to kill and eat cats. I have to assume it was a cultural thing. Nowadays, we have a lot more respect for animals. And I think back then, people just didn't really understand that animals had feelings like we do. So don't fault them too much for killing all of these cats. They honestly probably didn't know any better. So let's take a moment to really imagine what this guy was like. He was an incredibly normal-looking guy, and he had an incredibly nice disposition. He was only 13 years old. He was from Poland, living in France, working for the French military. So he seems like this kind, quaint little guy, and then he's just out there eating cats and and eating 5 pounds of grass. It definitely brings a different image to my mind than Tarrare. They're almost like the same but opposite at the same time, and I find it very comical. My favorite thing about him is still yet to come. There was an experiment that they did, and I feel like his personality kind of shows through how he acted after the experiment, but we'll get to that later because we have to explain why on earth he was here working for the French military and then suddenly in London. Well, yet again, it's because he was captured. But the story of how he was captured is what's so interesting, because he performs one of his most heinous acts yet. So he was on a French warship in February of 1799, and cannonballs were fired at this ship. This blew off the leg of one of his fellow soldiers on the French army side, and Domery, unable to help himself, just went in on the leg and started eating it, which prompted his fellow soldiers to throw the leg overboard, I suppose just out of respect for the poor guy who lost his leg. So, his fellow soldier is not sitting there eating his severed leg while he's screaming in pain and probably going to die due to the lack of modern medicine at the time. Well, anyway, the soldiers were captured and brought to a British prison, and it was there that they were immediately disturbed by one of their captors' appetites. Domery was found eating the prison cat, as well as 20 rats, so I guess he did the job of the cat, so I guess it's all right. So they started giving him 10 times the rations of a normal soldier, which, good thinking compared to the 2 times and 4 times that just don't work on this kind of guy. He still was not satisfied, however, and he was still found just scavenging for absolutely whatever he could find. So it was at that point when the doctors became so fascinated they had to do yet another experiment. Now, thankfully for Domery, this was a lot more of a humane experiment than the things that were done to Tarrare that we discussed last week. I actually kind of love this experiment just because of the absolute absurdity. So the guys who did this experiment were Royal Navy Dr. J. Johnston and Dr. Cochrane. So here's what they did. One night, Charles was awakened at 4 a.m. to eat 4 pounds or 1.8 kilograms of raw cow's udder. So then they wake him up again at 9:30 a.m. and they feed him 5 pounds or 2.5 kilograms of raw beef, 12 large tallow candles totaling in 1 pound, and a bottle of porter. Then at 1 p.m., they feed him basically the same meal as before, 5 pounds of beef, 1 pound of candles, and this time 3 bottles of porter, so I suppose he's quite drunk at this point. It's worth noting that during the course of this experiment, he ate everything that was given to him. He did not defecate, urinate, or vomit at any point during the whole experiment, and his pulse remained regular and his skin did not change temperature. So it seems like his sweating problem maybe was only at night. It's kind of hard to say because they did wake him up at 4 in the morning, which is close to that 1 in the morning time that he would normally have his cravings, but it seems like he wasn't sweating excessively or having a fever or anything like that. Upon returning to his quarters at 6:15 p.m. following the conclusion of the experiment, he was recorded as being of particularly good cheer and supposedly danced around, smoked his pipe, and drank another bottle of porter. I just picture this guy to be the most entertaining person ever, just hilarious and great at parties. Would have loved to meet him, to be honest. Now, at this point, I'm pretty sure he was about 21, but keep in mind he started his military career when he was 13 years old, so it's just kind of crazy to think that back in the day we had 13-year-olds running around smoking and drinking and fighting wars and things like that. I suppose it was just a different time, and without a doubt, Charles Domery was a very different kind of guy. So some of the same modern writings that came out about Tarrare were also referencing this fellow Charles Domery. They're often in reference together, and that's why a lot of this information kind of overlaps. Plus the fact that they lived such parallel lives, fighting in the same war and everything like that. I personally find it really fascinating. It's just bizarre and strange to me that these two men existed at the same time and they could have met. They could have been brothers in arms for all we know, but unfortunately they did not meet. And we don't know what happened to Charles Domery after this because he just went off the record. There weren't any other documentations about him written by any of the notorious military or medical professionals or anything at the time. So he just kind of fell off the map, and we don't know what happened to him after this experiment. A lot of speculations about what was wrong with him involve the same kind of thing as Tarrare, where he may have had a damaged amygdala, which is a part of the brain that controls hunger, or a ventromedial nucleus, another part that also has control over those impulses as well. He also could have had some form of hyperthyroidism. It kind of seems similar to the Tarrare case in every way, except that it wasn't recorded specifically that he ate quite as much. It's odd because both of these men had a particular craving for raw meat. They would just kill and eat animals or eat tons and tons of beef raw. It was just incredible how much meat they can eat. Now, I don't know about you, but when I eat meat with a meal, it's usually just one part of a meal and I don't want too much of the meat or it's kind of heavy on my stomach. So I find it fascinating that these men who ate so much were eating specifically meat. But it also kind of reminds me of when somebody has some kind of deficiency. Like when my mother had an iron deficiency, she would go through bouts where she would have extreme cravings specifically for liver. I don't know why, but she would just specifically want liverwurst and she would run out to the store and get it at any given time. So it's a similar kind of craving when somebody has some kind of deficiency. So I'm thinking specifically for this case, obviously Tarrare had some kind of deficiency as well, but I feel like Domery may have had a deficiency that affected him at specific times of day more than others. While it seems like he still had these abilities at any time, I feel like you can condition your body to be able to eat more and more and more. Anybody can do that. It's why competitive eating exists. It's why obesity is a problem, because once you start eating more, you'll wind up just continuously getting used to eating that much. Your stomach can stretch itself, things like that. So this fella seemed to be in a lot better health than Tarrare, so it's possible they had a very, very similar or even the same condition, but it just presented slightly differently in these two men. As for media that was inspired by him, in 1852, Charles Dickens wrote, "Now, it is my opinion that a man like this, dining in public on the stage of Drury Lane, would draw much better than a mere tradition, who chews unsubstantial words instead of wholesome beef." So I guess this was some kind of jab at people who are tragedians. I think I'm pronouncing that correctly. People who performed in tragedies, things like that. So I think it's really interesting that Charles Dickens wrote about this guy. Honestly, I don't know about you, but I hope this guy lived the rest of his days very happy, even though he was a prisoner of war, and it's not very likely. He will always live on in my heart, and I can only hope he lived to dance and sing and drink 5 bottles of wine another day. Next week, you're going to be in for a real treat because we're going to be talking about Jacques de Falaise. He is actually the man that you may see if you Google Tarrare looking for a picture of him. A lot of people have mistakenly attributed this picture to Tarrare, but the man behind the picture is another Polyphage, Jacques de Falaise, living between the years of 1754 and 1825. The most interesting thing about him, instead of developing his polyphagia as a teenage boy or even younger in life, he actually developed it at the age of 62. You'll find out more about him in my next video, and I hope you enjoy it. I'll see you next week.